In this lesson, I was supposed to get started on the nhair's oversized hoodie, but I've postponed that for the next lesson. Initially, I was going to use simulation in ZBrush to sculpt some of the parts of this hoodie, but ZBrush simulation pales in comparison to Maya's nCloth. There are not enough settings to get very randomized and interesting folds in ZBrush. And since this is one of the main articles of clothing for this character, I've decided to sculpt it with nCloth instead of zCloth. So we'll get started on that in the next lesson. In this lesson, I've decided to perform some more nCloth tests with her bubble jacket. If you remember, I created this bubble jacket in the last lesson and run a few tests. I didn't quite like the results I ended up with, and I thought that it would be good to spend this entire lesson just experimenting with nCloth and how to make it simulate a bubble jacket in the best way. Here are some videos of how a puffer jacket of this type is supposed to simulate. If you notice, it's very stiff. There is very little articulation. I'm actually happy about this because that makes the task of simulating this thing a lot easier than I thought. I can rely on a low proxy mesh that doesn't have enough polygons to produce medium and tertiary scale deformation. That would leave me with just primary deformations, and that would make it mimic a more realistic result. In a future lesson, I will shoot for this stiff result. But in this lesson, I'm going to try to shoot for a little bit more of a busier result. I'm still going to end up with a fairly stiff simulation, but there will be a lot more articulation and deformation all over. A lot of the time with 3D animation, the goal is not just to replicate reality, it's to come up with more exciting results that provide more entertainment value. This is a stylized character, and a lot of the character's movements will end up being whippy and unrealistic. So I don't want a hyper-realistic jacket simulating over stylized animation. But there will be some animations that I will perform with this character where realistic movement of the jacket might be better suited for the situation. That is why in a future lesson, I will showcase some tests that produce a very stiff result, like we're seeing in the reference. I'll also make sure that the cloth room for this character has both proxy meshes. One high-res proxy mesh for the busier result with its own unique nCloth settings, and another low-res proxy mesh for a more stiff result, also with its own unique settings. All right, let's get started. Because of how busy my test file had gotten, I decided to create a new scene to test out some of the parameters that I'm going to be using. This allowed me to see changes a lot faster. The main test file had become so slow, and that's also one of the reasons I decided to rerun this test. I have used so many parameters that cost from a computation standpoint that it takes so long to cache the end result, and I realized that that's not going to work too well for me if I'm trying to simulate results, see them, and make the necessary changes. So what you're seeing right now is nCloth default settings simulating and colliding with two collision meshes. My solver settings are at the basic value, and another important value that I haven't touched is space scale, which I'll talk about later. The first parameter I started dialing in was pressure. So I set pressure to manual, like I had done in my original test file, and I realized immediately that a pressure of 1 in this test file was not behaving exactly like a pressure of 1 in my main test file. This file seemed to have a more bloated result. So that just let me know that pressure, when set to manual, does not behave consistently across files. It is dependent on some things. And I will talk about that shortly. As this video progresses, there's a point at which I realize what to do with pressure. But I ended up dialing from 1 to 0.25 and came to the conclusion that 0.25 is what I needed to inflate this puffer jacket to a good amount. Now, when we move on to the main test file, you'll see that this is in fact not the case. But I just wanted to point out that in this test file, a pressure of 1 inflated it to this really balloon-like state. And this is not consistent with how a pressure of 1 was behaving in the main file. The very next thing I moved on to experiment with was rigidity. But rather than set a constant rigidity value for the whole thing, I wanted to utilize rigidity in a specific region to see if I can stop that region from deforming completely. And the region I'm talking about is the neck area. So here you see me painting all around the collar or the neck of the puffer jacket. It's a way of designating nCloth properties to parts of an nCloth mesh. So what I'm doing right now would allow all this area that I'm painting, which is white, the white area, to utilize whatever value of rigidity I have set in my properties. And then everything else that's black just is treated like it's been set to a rigidity of 0. Once I was done painting, one thing I did do was flood, smooth the transition, just so I get a nice transition between the neck area that's going to be fairly rigid and the rest of the jacket that should not use any rigidity at all. I'm trying to be very careful with rigidity, because when you set it in areas that are going to do a lot of deformation, it just takes charge of the whole mesh and prevents it from deforming. But I will showcase shortly how I use rigidity and some other values that are similar to it to get the type of stiffening I need without stopping the entire jacket from deforming. And also, this is another thing that behaved fairly differently in this file, in this test file. One thing I do have to consider is that my main test file, there's a lot of movement. And so these results led me to believe that I might even be able to discard my component to component constraints in the main test file that hold the collar to the neck area. But anyway, I just want to point out that this is the last test I did in this test file before moving back to my main file. What you're seeing right now are the results of me transferring all my findings from my simple test file to my main test file. So as you can see, the behavior is not consistent. Here I have a pressure setting of 0.25. It did not inflate the puffer jacket to the same volume that it did in my simple test file. And also I did paint rigidity for the neck area, but that also didn't hold the neck area in place like it did in my simple test file. One thing I've done in this new main file is disconnect the wrap deformer that I was using to wire a high-res version of this puffer jacket to the low-res simulatable proxy. I did this so I could get faster feedback and be able to troubleshoot what the issues were. So what you're seeing right now is a low-res simulatable proxy with component to component constraints that connect the 2 zipper panels to the main jacket. And that's as much complexity as I want in this file for now. Another thing I also did was push out my animation from the HIK rig to an Alembic file and deleted the entire HIK rig and imported the animation as an Alembic. So all these things are intended to get this file to simulate faster. No wrap deformer, no rig, just my simulatable nCloth mesh, component constrained to 2 panels, and being driven by an Alembic animation. So to get this thing to behave, I started by increasing the usual parameters that I rely on to take charge of the simulation. Compression and stretch resistance, I cranked them up to 1,000. What you're seeing now is a better simulation that isn't all over the place because of the hiked up compression and stretch resistance. The other thing I started to do slowly was increase the pressure, the manual pressure value, and I went up from 0.25 to 0.4. The differences in simulation were negligible. I was starting to see that I was going to need significantly higher values. So I decided to halt on cranking it up any further and deal with some of the other issues I was seeing. One of the main issues I'm seeing is a lot of interpenetration, which I know can be resolved by increasing the self-collide width to stop this thing from getting too close to itself before it starts trying to calculate self-collision. So I increased that up to 6 from 3. And another thing that was not behaving too well was the component to component constraint in the neck area. In the last lesson, I had cranked it up to about 300, but it turns out that I needed more. So I doubled the value to 600 just to get the constraint to hold the collar area to the neck a lot better. Even though it helped, I ended up going with a new component to component constraint, which I will discuss shortly in the video. It was a better selection of points So you'll see that shortly. The other thing I wanted to try out, which helped with my first simulation, was dampening. But I didn't realize the negative impact that the dampening was having on the simulation. It makes the jacket feel like it's moving underwater, and I definitely didn't want that. I don't know why I wasn't able to spot that with the last simulation. So after trying a dampening of 100 and seeing how floaty it looked, I not only dialed it back to 0, but I started looking for ways to make the jacket feel even heavier. And the simple solution for that was mass. So here on the screen, I have 2 simulations. One of them was my first increase of mass to 100. And the second one was hiking up of the mass value to 1000. And this yielded results that I was really starting to like. The jacket was feeling a lot heavier and things were looking great. I do want to point out that there is a value when you're working with nCloth that you usually have to pay attention to before you start simulating that I ignored, and it's the Nucleus Space scale. Since 1 unit in my scene is equal to 1 centimeter, that Nucleus Space scale needs to be changed to the appropriate value, which would be 0.01. And because I haven't done that, that's why most of the time when I'm cranking up these values, I have to pick these obscenely high numbers. But it's not a big deal. You can still crank it up to these high numbers to get it to behave the way you want to. But usually when you start, you want to look at what 1 unit is equal to in your scene, what your scene scale is, and then adjust this space scale value in the nucleus. So after taking a look at it with these new hiked up values, compression and stretch resistance 1000, pressure increased to 0.4, self collide width increased to 6, the strength of the component constraint in the neck area to 600, and a mass of 1000, I started to realize that there were some major issues with the spacing of my animation. The animation that is being used here is not intended to be perfect, but I should have been mindful about how some of my paths of action and my spacing was behaving. Some of them were just horrible. I had these horrible path of actions and I had to turn on motion trails to fix them. And I also had to fix to the best of my ability what the various limbs were doing from frame to frame, because this type of bad motion was altering the simulation in a very bad way. And I was making a lot of decisions for nCloth and expecting it to behave a certain way, but the motion I'm giving it is just horrible. So here you see me cleaning up these animation curves in the main file. And when I was done, I re-exported the Alembic file to continue my tests in the main file with my cleaned up animation. The next thing I moved on to do was reinforce my component to component constraints. So by reinforce, what I mean is that I'm going to select more points. I'm going to delete the current component to component constraint. And you're seeing me select way more vertices inside the puffer jacket's collar and also around the neck so that I can create a constraint that utilizes more points. The end result is a more vice-like grip on the collar area as it simulates. And this is very good because initially the very few points that I had selected were making it very difficult to hold the collar in place. That's why I had to crank up the strength of the component to component constraint to 600. So after testing the simulation with the new selected points for the component to component constraint, I realized that the 600 strength is a little bit too much. So I started bringing it down gradually. I halved it to return it back to 300, but even that 300 was pretty strong and it was holding the collar in place. Before moving on to reduce it any further, I decided to also recreate the wrist component to component constraints. And with this, I also use the same methodology of selecting more points inside the jacket's cuff and on the hands so that I get a more tighter hold of the jacket's cuff to the wrist area. I do want to point out that this does mean the computation is more expensive. Whenever you're doing comp to comp constraints and you select so many points, it definitely does slow down the simulation some. But in this instance, I haven't cranked up too many expensive values, so it did not slow down my simulation that much. I was able to cache things very quickly. This is what the end result with both constraints working together looks like. Now, I did mention that the 300 strength for the neck area component to component constraint is a bit much, but I'm not going to change it now. You're going to see me change it later towards the end. I also want to point out that the component to component constraints for the wrist is fairly low, about 20, which is the default value. And it's doing a better job than my first simulation because of how many more points I've selected. So when I do bring down the strength of the one in the neck, I'm going to be aiming for values in that region, in the 10-20 region. You'll see this in effect later. At this stage, I decided to divert my attention to something else. The puffer jacket was having a very difficult time preserving its original design, its original shape. And I had in mind some things that I wanted to try. I had tried rigidity enough times to know what it would produce. So I decided to move on to input mesh attract. The nCloth documentation describes input mesh attract as a parameter that allows the simulated mesh to preserve its original shape a lot better. I decided to crank it up to a fairly high number just to see what it was doing, and then I eventually reduced it to 0.1. The impact now is a lot less visible, but it is doing some work if you look very closely to preserve the original form of it. Whilst I was checking out input mesh attract, I also found another parameter that I thought would help with preserving the original shape, and that's deform resistance. So I cranked down input mesh attract from the 0.15 and cranked up deform resistance. And it was also doing a pretty good job trying to hold the original shape. It does completely ruin the simulation. It doesn't look realistic at all, but you can tell that it's trying its best to hold this fabric in place. Now here is with deform resistance at 1. I'm definitely not going to use it at this value. But after trying out these two values, input mesh attract and deform resistance, I resolved to combine it with rigidity and use all three at a fairly low number to see what results I get. So you'll see me try that shortly, but before I jump into combining deform resistance, input mesh attract, and rigidity, I went back and dialed up a property that I believe I should have dialed up along with compression and stretch resistance, and that's shear resistance. It works in conjunction with stretch and compression resistance to prevent this thing from either stretching too far or compressing too much. It has something to do with the cross links of each polygon. I went ahead and cranked that up to 1,000, and now all three values are within the same range. With shear resistance out of the way, I decided to go ahead and try my plan to combine deform resistance, rigidity, and input mesh attract. What you're seeing on the screen is the result of all three of them working in conjunction with each other. All of them have been set to 0.15, so they're not too high to completely ruin the simulation, and they seem to be doing a good job trying to preserve the original shape. Not so much in the arms, because the arms are deforming a lot. So it's going to be hard for them to try to hold the original design of the hands. For now, this is something I'm okay with. When I go to shoot for the more stiffer result, I'll probably be using higher values to allow this thing to truly hold all this original sculpt design and just do some primary deformation. And part of that, as I mentioned initially, will be primarily dependent on the resolution of the simulatable mesh. If it's a really low res, as I said, it will not do all this minor articulation. To wrap up this test, I still had to figure out how to utilize pressure properly. So what I ended up doing was gradually increasing pressure. If you remember earlier in the lesson, I stopped increasing pressure at 0.4 and I postponed increasing it some more for later. I went to a pressure value of 5, then to 100. And then because I wasn't getting the results I wanted, I ended up cranking it all the way up to 8,000. And at 8,000, it seemed to do a pretty good job of giving this puffer jacket some volume. I actually went as high as 10,000 and then came back down to 8,000. What you're looking at right now, I think, is 8,000. But ultimately, you'll see towards the end of this video, one of the conclusions I drew about pressure is that it has to be keyed in specific areas. Initially, when I was reading how the property works, it did mention that the default option for the pressure method, which is the volume tracking method, seemed to be a value that was calculated in real time based on the volume of the mesh and something about how much air was flowing in and out of it. I thought the manual pressure setting was just a constant value you just had to enter, and it would pump that much air into the mesh, into the nCloth mesh. But it turns out that the manual setting is also something that has to be increased. And in my case, I'm finding that it has to be increased primarily where the animation starts to move a little bit more faster. I find that this thing has a very difficult time holding its volume as the animation speeds up. For the entirety of this lesson, I've only been showing about 100 frames of this animation. But if you remember, it's an entire sequence of her doing a burpee. And the parts of the burpee where she goes really fast, there was just a crumbling of the puffer jacket. And one of the ways I was able to prevent it from completely crumbling was by keying the manual pressure value. I'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end when I'm going over my conclusions that I drew for this test. I do intend on doing some more testing, but not in the next lesson. In the next lesson, I'm going to focus on getting his baggy hoodie done. But this is sort of a second part for the testing of her jacket. I'm hoping to be able to do a third to conclude how I'm going to simulate this bubble jacket when this character is rigged and ready. For now, to conclude this test with the 8,000 and above pressure setting, I moved on to crank up my solver settings to a very high number. One thing about solver settings is the higher they go, the less inner penetration issues there are with the nCloth. I always knew that. That's why I was ignoring all the penetration that you're seeing now that show the inside of the mesh. I knew that when the solver settings go up, most of them are going to be repaired. So here's the final simulation of the low proxy mesh with the solver settings cranked up to 30 for both the sub steps and max collision iterations. Another thing I did right after cranking up the solver settings is reducing the strength of the component to component constraint at the neck area. I mentioned I was going to do that, and I brought it down. As I mentioned, now that I have a lot more points, it holds a lot better, so I don't have to crank up the value so high. So I came down from 300 to about a strength of 10. All right, so we're nearing the end of this lesson. What you're watching right now are the final results for this test. I went ahead and wrapped Deform the high-res meshes back onto the simulatable low proxy mesh. And I also used a proximity pin constraint to pin the zipper to the left zipper panel. I'm going to go over a few takeaways from this test. Most of the takeaways revolve around setting keyframes on certain attributes at certain parts of the simulation. As you can see, there are still some issues towards the end with getting the nCloth to behave properly. And I showed you initially how I was setting keys on the manual pressure value from around frame 115 to 123. I crank up the pressure from 8,000 to 30,000. This is how it manages to hold its volume during the really fast parts. But another way that I'm also holding the volume is by keyframing rigidity, deform resistance, and input mesh attract. As you can see, they're also being keyed from frame 115 to 124 for when the animation gets really fast. And I crank them up by a tenth of a decimal point from 0.150 to 0.250. And this helps to prevent this thing from completely collapsing. So it'll really come down to keying a lot of parameters at key areas to prevent this thing from completely coming apart. And I think that's ultimately how you're expected to use nCloth. Most of the old school tutorials I used to watch had a lot to do with keying stuff. One particular thing that I've seen keyed a lot is solver settings. So even for something like that, when it gets to the point where there is simply too much collision happening, or it's moving so fast and it's having a difficult time calculating collision, it might be a smart idea for me to key substeps and max collision iterations to a higher number and then bring it back down, just so the simulation doesn't slow down. You just have to find out those key parts where things aren't really working too well and key the solver attributes so that more resources are allocated at that time in the animation to repair inner penetration. The same also applies to these component to component constraints. In this particular instance, I noticed that this is still too much of a hard grip on this neck area. So this will also be a good area to key the strength down when we're in a pose like this. For instance, where our hands drop, this thing is supposed to drop a lot more. So for around here, I could key it from a strength of 10 to maybe a 2, so it slides down the shoulders a bit more. So this is the end of this particular test. The next time I come to continue these tests, I'll be working to really get this second part of the animation that I'm getting a lot of rupturing of the jacket. I'm going to focus on trying to repair this with some of the conclusions I've drawn, mostly keying values. And ultimately, I will continue to work just to have this short test look really good. I'm doing a pretty good job documenting all the work I'm doing. So when it comes time to animate the real character in the real jacket, I think I'll have a sound workflow to resolve this jacket for any animations I create. And I also still want to point out that the deformation around here on her arm is really bad. So it's not helping that the nCloth is trying to wrap itself around some really bad distorted deformation, and that's why it's exploding as badly as it is. I'll work on repairing that before I continue the next set of tests so that I can end up with a test file that looks good all throughout. So that's the end of this lesson. In the next lesson, as I mentioned, I'm going to move on to sculpting his baggy hoodie. And I will probably also perform some tests with the article of clothing that I have done for him. So that would be his jeans and his baggy hoodie. So I'll see you in the next lesson where we get started sculpting his baggy hoodie and possibly also doing some simulation tests for that.